Hello, this time we are talking about ethics in psychological research. So moving beyond what is science, now that we know what science is, we have to make sure that we're doing science in a way that respects the people that we involve in our projects. For those of you in my class, you'll be researching on each other, so I think the justice and risks and benefits to your own participants should be paramount, since you will be a participant in their studies and they will be participants in yours. Anyway, so ethics is best discussed first through some historical examples. Most psychological ethics discussions involve one of three major historical sort of ethical foibles, if you will, that we can learn from. And some of the core ethical principles were built from, along with the guidelines that are specific to APA, the American Psychological Association, that we'll talk about, and how they've expanded upon that original ethics sort of rubric for professors and other researchers. And finally, some thoughts about how ethics is not a black and white decision. There's a lot of gray areas and a balancing sort of act in how you respect people, and also try to answer the questions that you have with the people or sources that you have to answer those questions. So first of all, there's three major ethical historical examples that we tend to refer to. The Milgram obedience studies, the Zimbardo prison studies, and the Tuskegee syphilis studies. The first one, Stanley Milgram, was doing studies in response to some of the atrocities that we've seen in war. And Zimbardo is very similar in that regard, and has also been sort of paralleled or mirrored in more recent examples of sort of war crimes in prisons, and how people can sort of fall into a mindset of either guard or prisoner, or a victimizer or victim. Milgram, that was Zimbardo. Milgram was really having people sort of explore their obedience through the researcher asking them to conduct this sort of aggressive or dangerous experiment, shocking people during a learning task. And of course, even though in the Milgram case they did debriefings, as we'll talk about, it's still kind of a scarring experience for those participants, potentially. Same thing with Zimbardo. It was scarring and troublesome, and may not have had safeguards that should have been in place, right? Tuskegee was one of the most atrocious examples where they were really risking the lives and well-being of participants far beyond what they should have, in somewhat of a racist way. Not somewhat, it was basically segregated based on race, and the participants were treated basically different based on their race. So that's about as bad as you can get in terms of an ethic example. So Tuskegee is one that we talk about a lot, and illustrates three of the major unethical things, or what we could say the researchers made in terms of choices on how to handle participants, right? First, they were not treated with respect, right? So they were not given the medications and respect they deserved as human participants, right? They were harmed in the process of this, right? So they not only weren't given the choice of the medication, but they were harmed through the process, potentially lied through, which is respect and sort of harm. And they were also sort of a lower income group, disadvantaged social group, we could say, as African Americans. And we see this in research all the time. People offering money for people who maybe are in need of money to participate in things that maybe are physically harmful, maybe emotionally scarring, but they're wooed into it for a variety of reasons. And you can be coerced into any sort of study if it's not of your free will, right? This study, the Tuskegee study, just happens to sort of highlight many of the horrible decisions that researchers can make in the process of seemingly going about a question that is a good question, but in a bad way, right? The Milgram study really asks about that sort of larger benefit to society based on the sorts of risks you're giving participants, right? So that's sort of the cost-benefit or beneficence we'll get to later on, but it's the idea of balancing risk to participants with benefits to society. And in this case, these people could have been long-term harm could have been done. These participants could have been damaged psychologically for a long time based on the process that they went through. In this case, seemingly potentially killing someone in the name of research and just following directions. I encourage you to look this up to see the expressions on the people's faces as they're operating this shock generator on the learners in the tasks, seemingly going through the experiment, but some of them knowing very clearly that what they were doing was wrong. And you'll see that some people stopped, of course, and refused to continue with the experiment, which in some cases is very hard and really speaks to some of the situations we find ourselves in every day, that we sort of continue on with what we're doing based on expectations that show what would you do is a great example of this, when they put people in sort of everyday situations and see if they would go through or not act in terms of a sort of a bystander effect sort of situation. Are they not acting when they should, potentially? Anyway, some of these studies, as I said, Tuskegee, bad. Zimbardo we don't go through, but I encourage you to look up the videos for that as well. Basically, you'll see people walking around acting like prisoners, and that sort of highlights some of these concerns as well, that the Belmont report sort of outlined in their principles the idea that we should be respecting participants, the persons in our studies, so letting them know fully, which I don't think was the case in the Zimbardo study, letting them know fully what they were getting into, in that case a jail, and some sort of humiliating treatment that was not necessarily outlined ahead of time. The beneficence idea is that sort of major thing highlighted by the Milgram studies, the cost-benefit, right? Potentially harming these people, making them think they murdered somebody for the rest of their lives, or maybe could have murdered them. Because the interesting thing about the Milgram studies, they had very good debriefing procedures. Debriefing being the sort of the talk or the instructions that are given to participants after the study ends, letting them know what it was about, what the hypotheses really were, if there's any staging or masked elements, sort of letting them know what that was, and ideally through a self-discovery process, we call it, where they sort of start to realize what happened, that person they were working with was not really a learner, they were working with a researcher, and they were never really hurt. But, if you thought you hurt somebody, that you could hurt somebody, you have to make sure that the research is going to be benefiting society in a way that risk is worth it. Anyways, the principle of justice there is sort of just that everybody should be treated equally. Costs, rewards, benefits of the study. For example, in my field, IO psychology, if some people are trained in an organization, even for experimental reasons, and it helps them, it benefits them in terms of their performance, really all the employees should be offered that training to equally benefit everybody. That's a very applied example, though. Anyways, the APA sort of took this Belmont report and ran with it. They have their own ethical principles that they put out. The APA is somewhat of a body that governs psychologists in terms of their ethics, but it is somewhat political in nature too, so these can change, and they can be debated. For example, when the war was going on, some psychologists cited on the side of the fence that psychologists could participate, interrogation techniques and things like that. Others cited on the fence that you should not, as a psychologist, participate in any sort of interrogation or war crime activities. So the APA typically has to sort of, balance those interests and philosophies, and then come up with some sort of guiding principle, which isn't always right at first, right? And that Lillian Field article that I assign y'all later in the semester is an example of that. Anyway, so the Belmont report sort of got expanded by the APA. So the beneficence, justice, and respect for persons, or autonomy, are still in there, but they added in this sort of fidelity and responsibility, this sort of idea that professional behavior or things like that should be happening according to their policies within the specific fields, whether it be therapy, teaching, whatever. And then integrity, right? To be truthful, honest, and really be up to date as a teacher practitioner with the skills and ideas that are out there. For example, if I never presented this or never talked about the APA, that might be somewhat deficient, and my integrity as an instructor would be questioned, right? So going through these one more time in terms of the original core ones, beneficence is, remember, that risk-benefit analysis. So it's thinking about physical harm that could be done to participants, but also the emotional harm or stress that they could undergo as part of this experiment. Some of the ways we sort of act to protect participants, especially in things like surveys, right, are by controlling who knows the information, right? So keeping it anonymous, so nobody knows what answers were provided by who, or confidential, where you may know whose answers go with whom or what choices or whatever they made, or what categories they fall into, but that's somewhat confidential. Only the researcher maybe, or the research assistant knows. Most research we do is confidential to the point where it's pretty much anonymous. You might be able to figure out who said what, but you don't record any of that information. Usually it's just demographics that we get. So hopefully we're mitigating any risk-benefit. We even mask their IP address of their computer so that there's no way we could identify who they are. The autonomy, or what's called the respect for persons, it's both of those, called different things by different people. This is the autonomy or free will of people, right, to enter into this study. So respecting their freedom is respect for participants, respecting their autonomy, right? And in some cases, it's not that you're respecting their freedom, you're respecting that they're in a situation where they need to have protection by another individual, or at least guidance, right? So if someone's under 18, someone is, let's say, an individual with a disability, those people have sometimes caretakers who have to sign consent. So research I've done with individuals with disabilities looking for employment, we have to get their parental guardian sort of signature, as well as maybe people like caseworkers dealing with them, in addition to their own signature, of course, and letting them know what they're participating in. But getting those caretakers approving, being aware in the informed consent, or the consent form, letting them know what's being done in the study, is very important, right? Even more so if there's any sort of deception. Deception is when we're, sort of having some sort of guise, interacting with someone who's not who they say they are. So like the Milgram study, where there was a teacher and a learner, and the learner was basically an actor. That actor is a form of deception. So in the debriefing, we have to explain to them what was going on there, and ideally through that self-discovery process. And to institutional review boards, to the ethics committees, we have to defend even the use of that deception, and why other alternatives that do not include lying, that are some other method of manipulating this variable, are not being used. And we have to lie, or we have to put on some sort of staged or masked manipulation. That final one, the justice one, is really what's highlighted in the Tuskegee's syphilis studies. Not everybody is being treated in a way that they're benefiting in the same way, right? In this case, race was used as that segregating factor of who is getting a beneficial treatment and who is being treated in a disrespectful sort of manner, right? But this can be not as serious and as severe and as horrific as the Tuskegee studies. It can be something like education, training, compensation, like I mentioned. If that is differential, or if people even have a higher likelihood of being compensated based on something like demographics, the justice there is somewhat out of whack, if you will. Some other things that we like to point out is it's not just these sort of like review board type sort of philosophies. There's specific types of things that the APA asks for, such as the existence of these review boards, certain standards for things like consent, how to use deception and when to use debriefings, and then of course some additional things about data fabrication, making up data that wasn't there before, or falsifying data, in addition to plagiarizing other authors, so using the words of other authors. They have some guidelines related to that, and of course universities like ours have their own specific guidelines on plagiarism. And then of course there's animal research out there, so they have their own policies related to the care and use of animals, and there's a completely different IRBs specific to animals. So giving animal researchers a shout out. There are legal protections for animals within lab settings, especially designed to make sure that they're cared for, that the use of them is minimized, things like that. So they call it the 3 R's, the replacement, refinement, and reduction of animals. Refinement of procedures, right? So that animals are sacrificed in the most humane way, and we use as few of them as possible, right? Because, of course, not just because it's the right thing to do, but different people have different attitudes on this, right? You know, scientists, students, animal rights groups all have particular sort of viewpoints on this, but I think the overall sort of guiding principle is that you have to balance sort of the welfare, right, and the rights of the animals with the benefits and the knowledge that we could be gaining from this animal research, right? So making sure that this is done in a responsible way, not using animals in situations where it could be simulated or done in some other way, right? Use humans in a way that we don't necessarily have to then scan their brains afterwards with some sort of chemical treatment. If you can get away with not doing that, it's best, right? So anyway, so that highlights that ethical decision making really is, it's a different, it's a host of different priorities, or a balancing act of different issues, right? Getting the knowledge you need while respecting participants, treating them equally, making sure they're not lied to, but also, making sure that it's a realistic environment. We haven't gotten to fidelity and, the realistic nature of the experiment yet, but those will come into play as well. You want it to be as realistic as possible while respecting your participants as much as possible. So you need to weigh that sort of harm or potential harm, physically, emotionally, to the humans or animals, right, against that knowledge we'll gain, how it will contribute to society, better the lives of children, adults, workers, whomever it might be. But in some cases, we've learned a great deal from things like animal research, so the defense is there. When you're doing things like curing severe anxiety or schizophrenia or drug addiction, those things can really be weighed against very minimalistic, very compassionate animal use, and of course, compassionate and appropriate use of human subjects as well, right? Anyways, with this review process that the review boards do, when they judge the research, whether it's human or animal, the type of research matters, right? That will really dictate the type of review process that is needed, but they always are reviewed in some way, human and animal research. So it goes in, there's some sort of process for each university or review board, but typically it goes in as a review process where different people get it based on the type of research it is, with the exempt, minimal, and then full, requiring more people as you move up that ladder, with maybe 1 or 2 people looking at it if it's called exempt, or sometimes called administrative, which is the lowest level of review, maybe like a survey or something like that, not asking any sensitive questions. Goes to the people, they review it. If they ask for changes, it gets sent back. You revise it, resubmit it, and then you get a certain amount of time once it's approved to conduct your research. If it's a full review, more people get to see it. It takes a little bit longer. They might ask for more changes, but then you still get time to collect your data or whatever. And of course, there's totally different bodies that review this for animals versus humans as participants. I've only done human research, so I send mine to a particular body of people who review it to make sure that my protocol is sort of meeting the expectations of that Belmont report, the APA, and other sort of ethical bodies, because it's not just for psychological research. They're governing research for all sorts of different studies, sociological, historical, psychological, whatever. I had to throw in a little comic here, really illustrating that, it's not a question of if you're doing research, should you go through the IRB. If your research requires it, you pretty much have to go through, right? Sometimes in organizations and other sorts of industries, they don't do this, but for us that publish into journals, a lot of times now they'll ask for the actual protocol number for the IRB, or at least ask that it did go through ethics approval process before you collected data. So it's kind of mandatory now. For y'all students, you may or may not be collecting data for any real research sort of publication in the near future. But some of these things really do apply to you, such as the plagiarism I mentioned earlier that the APA dictates, and our university has their own policies on you should review. But then also I alluded briefly to types of data fraud, right? Fabricating, manipulating, or using your results in a misleading fashion when you discuss them. So of course fabricating is adding data that didn't exist. Manipulating is sort of changing, eliminating data points potentially, or not eliminating sort of extreme data points where they maybe should be. And all of that could be wrapped up into just, not necessarily communicating in the most honest way what your results mean. And finally, authorship issues is not a huge concern for y'all, but when you do get to sort of present posters and things like that, authorship does sometimes have meaning. Sometimes the first author is the person who came up with the idea or did the most work. Sometimes the last author is the person who runs the lab, but typically there's some sort of meaning to the authorship, especially on research-oriented journal articles. In most cases, first author is the most important person on that, or who contributed the most to the piece. Anyways, let's hope that we all do ethical research this semester, and see you next time.